So a very warm welcome to everybody this evening for our lecture with Dr Louise Fenton on Voodoo, Fact or Fiction. My name is Paula Harrison and I'm the coordinator at University Centre Telford. We're part of the University of Wolverhampton and we're based in Telford in the heart of Shropshire. We would normally hold our public lecture programme in our centre and invite obviously a lot of local people from Shropshire, but because of the current pandemic we've had to move our lectures online, and this has obviously been really exciting because it's meant that we've had a global reach, and Louise's lecture last week meant that we had people from 17 different countries take part, which is just phenomenal. So really, really exciting. Now, before I hand over to Louise, just to explain that there is a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen if you're using a desktop, and Louise will answer the questions. I'll read them out and Louise will answer them in order at the end of the lecture. If you're using a mobile device, the Q&A button will be in the top right-hand corner. So hopefully that's all okay. So it's the Q&A button, and I noticed that we've got a question already. Hopefully everybody has joined okay. Just to welcome Louise as well as everybody who's joined us tonight. Louise is a cultural historian, illustrator and writer. She has a BA and an MA in illustration from the University of Wolverhampton. She completed her PhD on the representations of voodoo at the University of Warwick in 2010. Louise is now a senior lecturer in contextual studies at the University of Wolverhampton. Her recent research has been focused on the visual and literary representations of otherness and the social history of witchcraft, voodoo and zombies. So a very warm welcome again to Louise, and I'll hand over to you now for your lecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paula, and thank you to you and all your staff for the support I've had in doing these talks. Welcome everybody. This is a very strange situation because although you're online, I just want to reiterate the fact I can't see any of you. So if you're making cups of tea or wandering around, that's fine. I don't know. So thank you for joining us tonight. Tonight's lecture is on voodoo, fact or fiction. And what I'm going to do is to talk a little bit. It is a basic overview. There is no way I can delve deeply into this religion, as it's complex, it's multifaceted, it's fascinating, it's mysterious, but I can't do it all in a half-hour lecture. So please forgive me if I miss anything. Do feel free to email me. I'm just going to share my screen for the start of the lecture. So hopefully this will work. You should now have my slide in front of you, I hope. It's not showing as a slideshow for some reason. There we go. So as you can see on this screen, my email is there, louise.fenton@wlv.ac.uk. If after the lecture you find you have a question, please don't hesitate to contact me. I took quite a few emails last week. If everybody does, give me a few days to get back to you, but I will answer any email questions afterwards, as well as the Q&A we're doing after the lecture. So I'm going to talk about Vodou in Haiti and voodoo as we probably think we know it. First of all, the spelling. Voodoo, vodou, voodoo, vodou, vodun. These are just 5 spellings. During my research, I've probably come across 15 or 16. If you've got a spare half hour, you could try variations of the spelling. There are several of them. But it's down to interpretation, it's down to misunderstanding, language barriers. So in different readings you might look at, if you are interested and you read articles about voodoo, you will see several spellings. For the purposes of tonight and generally, voodoo, the one on the left, VOODOO, is akin to the religion as it's practiced in West Africa. Today, we refer to many West African beliefs as voodoo. We also believe the beliefs in New Orleans and Louisiana. We call that voodoo, but it's also a term that's been generalized and used for stereotypes, as in the image below it, with the death and frightening image and the little doll. That's the more popularized and stereotyped version of voodoo. The correct spelling for Haitian Vodou, the religion, is Vodou. This is the preferred term, and it's what I'm going to use. So if I'm talking about the religion, I will talk about it as Vodou. If I'm talking about the more popular culture versions, it will be voodoo, just to clarify. Now, I know you can't answer me and I can't see you. However, when you think of the word voodoo, what do you think of when you hear the word? I'm sure when you saw this lecture, many of you had an impression of what it is. I'm sure we've got some in the audience who are quite knowledgeable about the religion. However, when you hear the word voodoo, what does it mean to you? And where has your understanding come from? For me, mine started 20 years ago, which I'll talk about in a minute. But what I want to say first is what voodoo is not. Voodoo is not a cult. It's not black magic. And it's not devil worship. Sorry to disappoint. People who practice are not witch doctors, they're not sorcerers, they're not occultists. It's not widely practiced with the intention to harm or to possess or control people, even though Hollywood have you believe that. The intention is mainly to heal. Most voodooists have never seen a voodoo doll. They wouldn't know what one was. It's not morbid and it's not violent. It's not the same everywhere and it's not the same for everyone. It evolves and adapts to situations, to circumstances, to cultures, to place. And people who actually practice voodoo would say that they are serving the spirits or they're in service. They wouldn't say that they're voodooists. So I'm often asked, how did I get involved in voodoo? How did it all start? And I'm going to cover that today because it's always one of the questions. My own understanding came from the 1960s cartoon series Scooby-Doo, one of my favourites, still is today, and I was so pleased that I could feature Scooby-Doo in my PhD. In the episode Which Witch is Which, we have a witch, a zombie, mentions of Haiti, voodoo dolls, pins in dolls, and it's this eclectic mix of all things weird and wonderful that led me to believe that, you know, they're all interlinked. And then moving on to the 1970s, the iconic James Bond film, Live and Let Die, which I'm sure a majority of you will know, and a majority of you will have your understanding of voodoo from this very film. I did an MA in illustration in the late 1990s. And during that time, I was fortunate to go on holiday to the Dominican Republic, where I met an artist, and he was from Haiti, and we talked through broken language, but we managed to speak a little bit. And what he told me about voodoo was not what I understood it to be. And I realized that my understanding was from these sources, very popular culture based, and it sparked my interest. I wanted to know what was voodoo really about. And that's how I became involved. It just grabbed my attention. So I then began researching, moving on to do a PhD, which was completely on the representations of voodoo, based on Haitian Vodou. And I looked at cinema, literature, television, theatre, animation, and art. So I looked across the board at how did we and how did popular culture construct our understanding of voodoo. Stereotypes abound, and these are the key ones that always appear. Baron Samedi on the top left is from Live and Let Die. The maniacal laughter at the end of the movie where he sat on the back of the train, where he's been shot and killed and shot and fallen in with snakes and died and resurrected. Iconic. And this is our knowledge of Baron Samedi. Underneath is from The Princess and the Frog, a Disney film set in New Orleans. Top right, the voodoo doll with the pins, of course. And bottom right is a scene from Night of the Living Dead with the zombies. Now I know this will be of key interest to a lot of you, and I haven't got the time to discuss zombies. I think that's a whole other talk that I might have to speak to Paula about scheduling in. But zombies is part of Haitian culture. It's part of our popular culture understanding. I just haven't got the time to go into it this evening. So I'm sorry if that was what you were hoping on, but I'm going to tell you now about how Vodou evolved in Haiti. So, as you can see on this image, the West African coast is highlighted in slight yellow, and that's the main source of the slave trade and the supply of slaves. The orange that's going transatlantic is showing the percentage of slaves and where they were heading for, and most of them were heading for the West Indies. Now, this area you can see in the centre, this was ruled by the Fon people, and it was the Empire of Dahomey. And that covers what we know today as Togo, Benin and Nigeria, which you can see just above Ghana in the middle. Most of the Haitian slaves were taken from Dahomey, but there were also some of the Yoruba people which were taken from the Empire of Oyo, which was just next to Dahomey. So that's predominantly where they came from. In the 1700s, Dahomey was a really powerful nation. It was a strong empire, and they were selling their own people as slaves to the slave trade. Most of their sales were the undesirables. They were their criminals, and also, interestingly, a lot of their priests. They were so concerned that the priests of West African belief systems were a threat to the empire and to the power, so they wanted rid of them. So they shipped out many priests along with the criminals. But it was quite lucrative. It was very lucrative. However, Dahomey began to wane in the 1800s as the slave trade finally ceased. France took over the area, and eventually it became a colony of France, and it was called Benin, which we know today. The word Vodou actually comes from the Fon language, and it means spirit or God. The West Africans practiced a religion which was fostered. It was fostering a personal relationship between the personal and ancestral spirits, along with spirits of nature. So the main elements: earth, fire, air, and water. So this was how they believed their spirits worked. And these beliefs formed the foundation of Haitian Vodou. Most of them came from this area. The most powerful West African spirits became the most important spirits in Haitian Vodou. And they were called Rada. They were called the Rada Pantheon, which I'll talk about in a minute. They were the Haitians' primary link to their traditions and their homeland. That's all they got left. They'd lost their identity, they'd lost their culture, but they could hang on to their beliefs. So where is Haiti? For those of you who don't know, it's in the Caribbean, in the Greater Antilles. And if you look, you've got Cuba to the left in an orange colour, Jamaica just below it, and then to the right of that in yellow is Haiti. It's part of an island which is now called Hispaniola, which was called Saint-Domingue in the past, and it's linked to Dominican Republic. So Dominican Republic is still Spanish, and Haiti was French. I say was because I'll talk about a little bit of the history. So that's where it is. Haiti wasn't the only culture that had a religion that evolved from slavery. Many other areas of the Caribbean did too. So for example, there's Santeria in Cuba, Candomblé in Brazil, Obia in Jamaica. And these are all very similar. They're syncretic religions where different beliefs are brought and forced together to create new belief system. Vodou in Haiti developed from the 16th century right the way through to the 18th century. On arrival, this is now talking a little bit about how it evolved. So on arrival, as slaves arrived, they were frequently and forcibly baptized into the Catholic faith. And they had to do this within 8 days. Missionaries had been in Haiti since the early 1700s and felt that by baptizing them as Catholics, it was a way to civilize and I'm using this in inverted commas, to civilise the savages, and that's written repeatedly in documents of the time. They felt that by adopting a more Christian religion, they would forego their beliefs. However, what did happen was that Catholicism just became a camouflage for the African beliefs. So voodoo and Vodou started to evolve underneath the Catholic faith. The plantation owners weren't so keen on their slaves being baptised as Catholics because it meant that they had to be given time to worship, which the plantation owners were not happy with. However, what the slaves did was then use songs, use the prayers within their own belief system, and Vodou evolved. There were other influences on the evolution of Vodou. It wasn't just the West African beliefs. There were a very few, because most were slaughtered in colonisation, but there were a few of the indigenous peoples, the Taino and the Caribs, who also brought new spirits, new beliefs and new religious objects to Vodou. So there's this syncretic, which is an amalgamation of all of these different belief systems. And a lot of this idea of baptism into the Catholic faith was as much about fear as it was about control. But if you think about the volume of slaves and the number of the white people in power, they needed some way of control. Now, what happened, each of the Catholic saints were adopted and appropriated for voodoo spirits. So each of the spirits has got its Catholic counterpart. These are just two of them. So on the left, this is a painting from Haiti, a village in Haiti, of St. Peter. St. Peter holds the keys to heaven. He's believed to be the gatekeeper, and he is associated with Papa Legba. And Papa Legba he stands at crossroads, and he is the gatekeeper between the material and the spiritual world. On the right, we've got an image of St. Patrick, who is believed to have driven all snakes out of Ireland. And he is associated with Dambala, whose image is also serpents. He's represented by serpents and snakes. The one on the right is one of the Vodou flags, which I'll talk about in a little while. But each of them, every Catholic saint, there is a voodoo counterpart. So each of the spirits was hidden. And these images could be talked about and worshipped, with the slaves knowing that they were talking about their spirits, but the plantation owners believing they were talking about Catholic deities. So the belief system in voodoo, it recognises one supreme being. They believe in God, a God. And bon Dieu is the Creole for le bon Dieu, which is the French for the good God. So this is the all-powerful God at the top, totally untouchable. He's a divine, he's a divine essence, and he's found in every part of creation. So he's found in spirits, in people, in the animate, in the inanimate. He's in mankind. The voodooist believes that bon Dieu created man in his image, but he's too great to be directly involved in day-to-day life. They believe in God's will, but they don't believe that they're close enough. They're too detached from him to be able to ask for help. But the spirits they have a personal relationship with, he's out of reach. And to connect with the spiritual world, it's believed that bon Dieu created the Loa, who are the assigned spirits to deal with day-to-day. This is spelled LWA. Sometimes you might see it spelled LOA, but they're the Loa. And the Loa oversee everything in life: marriage, birth, death, work, celebrations, commiserations. Everything in day-to-day life is overseen by the Loa. And the Loa are ancestral spirits or spirits of nature. So again, they're linked to earth, wind, fire, air, water, as well as spirits of the dead, because it's believed that your ancestors acquired knowledge, wisdom, and that they don't go away. They're there to be called upon when needed. The bottom part, where you can see Rada and Petro, these are the Nanchon, or the rites, sometimes referred to as the pantheons, and these are the groups of the spirits, groups of the Loa. Rada is the most popular, and these relate to Dahomey. These relate to the spirits from Dahomey. They are the largest of the rites, and most books I've read, it's a binary, they're Rada or Petro, but there are many others, and it's believed there could be as many as 15, but because Voodoo is an oral tradition, nothing's written down. We've only got to listen, and we can only talk to people, and some of these pantheon or rites are so small, only a very small amount of people know about them, and so they're not widely known by the West. So we've got Rada from Dahomey. Petro evolved in Haiti, and this is seen as the dark side of Vodou. It's the Petro rites that are believed to be linked to zombification, to war, to anything that's to harm, to cause pain. That's the Petro rites. And as in everything, there's good and evil. However, the Rada rites are the ones that are usually used. But there are others. Congo originates in Congo. Igbo and Nago are both from Yoruba people. Guinean is from Guinea, Bambara from Sudan, Bangol is from Angola, and Siniga is from Senegal. So we have this whole pantheon of spirits. Some of the lower, they obviously have a name. They then have what they represent and the image that's associated with them in imagery. So if you see paintings of serpents, you know it's relating to Dambala. If you see a rainbow, you know it's related to Aida Wedo, and that's for fertility. Papa Legba, who looks at the gateways, he's represented by a cross. Ogu is war, fire, and metalwork, and he holds a machete. Azili Frida is love and beauty, represented by a heart. Baron Samedi, the most common and most frequently seen, represents death, and his is cross, coffins, or a phallus. Azaka, also known as Sinzaka, he's for agriculture, and he's seen to be carrying a big bag. It's called a makut, it's a soft bag that goes over the shoulder. Or Bosu, male fertility and black magic, from the Petro rites, and his is a bull. So you can see just some of them. They also have a colour associated with them, they have offerings associated with them, and they do have sacrifices, animal sacrifices suggested for each one. So where do these ceremonies take place? Anywhere. In the 21st century, they might take place in a basement in a New York apartment. They might take place in a field in rural Haiti. Even in the Dominican Republic, a lot of people have now moved over to the Dominican Republic. But most of the time, and traditionally, they take place in what's called a Peristel. And that's a building with usually a corrugated roof in the centre of a village. It's a focal point, like a community centre. Inside the Peristel is a potomitan, and that's this central pole, and that's in everyone. Sometimes it's square, usually round, but the potomitan, which you can see on the left image, which painted green and white, is the central focus, and that's believed to be the link between the spiritual and the material world. Always in some form is there one of those. On the right, you can see a veve, and this is a drawing that's done in cornflour, chalk, ash, talcum powder, whatever's handy. It's drawn prior to a ceremony and links specifically to one lower. So the ceremony generally is to ask for a lower, and the purpose of it is to bring the spirit to the material world. The Voodooists believe that if they evoke a spirit, it will ride one of them. It's known as riding, but it possesses them. And they believe that somebody within the congregation will be possessed, and they then take on the characteristics of that particular lower. So for example, this one on the right is for Baron Samedi. You've got the cross, which is symbolic of death, and he is one of the spirits of the dead. He's also very arrogant, he's quite sexual. So if he was the spirit that possessed one of the congregation, you would expect them to be very cocky, to be very arrogant, to be strutting around, to be quite lewd in their suggestions. He often smokes cigars, he likes a drop of rum, you can see the rum bottles there. And when he possesses, then they know that it's been successful. The start of the ceremony is the drummers. The drummers set the pace. Initially, in many places, the ceremony would start with almost a small procession of the Vodou flags, which are known as the drapeau Voodoo, which are sequin flags In some academics believe they represent the stained glass windows of Catholic churches. Some believe they're just decorative and are designed to evoke the spirit. So they're designed in the form of the spirit. They're brought in at the start and waved, so the procession starts. The drummers then begin. The drum beat builds the pace. Now, some of these ceremonies can go on for 12 hours. I was at one in New Orleans, which was nearly 14 hours long. So it started at lunchtime and went on till the early hours of the morning. So they can be very long, very, very long, but it builds. And the idea is this momentum brings the spirit. So you've got the veve on the floor, you've got the dancers, you've got the chanting, you've got the drumming going, and it builds and builds until somebody is finally possessed. Now, there are sacrifices, and this is a real contentious issue. Sacrifice does take place in Vodou, as it does in many other religions. It's not in isolation with Vodou. However, as we move forward, there are two reasons why it's on decline. Firstly, poverty in Haiti is rife, and to sacrifice an animal is an incredible expense. They do so for very important things. And what happens after the sacrifice, they would then cook the animal and it would feed the whole village. So it's not wasted. However, work I've done in New Orleans indicates that many voodoo priestesses and priests are now vegetarian or really do not agree to sacrifice. And so they find alternative offerings. It may be another foodstuff, it may be perfume or rum or tobacco, dolls, it could be anything else, but they find alternatives, and it seems to keep the spirits happy. White, in images you see of Vodou ceremonies, and most of the ones I show, people are wearing white, and the reason is because it's for purity and modesty, but it's also linked to the beliefs from Dahomey. It's the spirits, it's sacred to the spirits of Dahomey. However, as you can see from this image, much more relaxed these days. Many participants are in jeans and t-shirts and anything goes. And people are very open. In New Orleans on Halloween, if you're ever lucky enough to go, there are voodoo ceremonies which are accessible to the public, and they are very welcoming. In Haiti, a little less so. As I go on in a moment, I will talk a bit about the oppression and you'll understand why. You will sometimes see voodooists wearing blue or red, and that's symbolic of the Haitian flag, which is red, blue with the coat of arms in the middle. Altars are also part of Haitian Vodou. This one is for several different spirits. As you can see, the Catholic saints are at the back, and lots of colours are hanging on the altar. And most people have an affinity to one particular spirit or lower, so they would have a very small altar in their home or in their garden. I now want to talk a little bit about the history, because Haiti and Vodou played a pivotal role in the independence of Haiti. Voodoo was inspiration for the slaves to revolt in 1791. They'd had enough. They were oppressed, and they were, I'm sorry if you, by the way, I can hear somebody knocking my front door, so if you can hear that, I really apologise. I'm not going to answer it, I just apologise if you can hear it. This was the first and only successful slave rebellion in history. The whole fight for independence began with a Vodou ceremony. They evoked the petro rites. They slaughtered a black pig. They brought together as much power as they could, and this was the inspiration for the slaves to stand up and rebel against their oppressors, and they did. And after a long, long struggle and battle, they won. And it was independence on the 1st of January, 1804. Haiti was an independent republic, broken away from white colonial rule. However, Vodou has been continually suppressed since then, and I'm now going to talk a little bit about why. In the eyes of the West, in the 19th century, any element of African culture smacked of barbarism. Racism was integral to the West. No African culture could be deemed anything other than savage. In Haiti, the agitators who emerged from this amazing rebellion and independence struggle were used as proof across the West of the relationship between Vodou and savagery. It's often referred to in newspapers and books how it's the savages and the Vodou that caused this to happen. It was unbelievable. The West and the white could not believe this. And this continued. Racist notions of black sensationalism and the practice of Vodou sold newspapers, it sold books. And it meant that these rumours were spread and exaggerated misconceptions, and it promoted a view of black people as, especially in Haiti, as superstitious, as savages and inferior to whites. And that's what it was all about. This book was notorious, published first in 1884 and revised in 1889, even more sensational, was by Sir Spencer St. John, who was a Victorian envoy to Haiti. And in his book, he writes extensively of cannibalism and of sacrifice, human sacrifice, which was often referred to as the long pig. And this was all based on an account of a young girl who went missing in Haiti. And several people went searching for her. It was written about. And then after it escalated and more people were looking for her, they found her remains. And it was reported in the Western press that she'd been cannibalized and they'd eaten her, they'd sacrificed her and eaten her. He picked up on this, but every account in his book is that he'd spoken to somebody who'd heard about. There was never any evidence of any cannibalism on Haiti ever, since records began in the late 17th century, no evidence whatsoever. But he also wrote about how Christianity could help save the Haitians. In the early 1900s, there was a calamitous political situation in Haiti. They were in a real problem situation. It resulted in 1915 of the lynching of their president. That's how serious it was. But Vodou was used as an excuse. A previous US minister who was working in Haiti wrote to the US government and stated that the president, who was lynched shortly afterwards, and his family were devotees of Vodou, and therefore Haiti could not govern itself. America needed to step in, and goodness me, did they step in. In 1915, they colonized again. They went in and took over Haiti. It was called the American occupation. It lasted from 1915 to 1934. And during this time, they enforced the legal prohibition of Vodou. So although a century before Haiti gained its independence, they were now being oppressed once again. And it was during this time that more lurid accounts were coming out in published form, written and widely circulated by people who were deemed to be truthful and honest. They were serving military. They couldn't be lying about what was going on in Haiti. The book on the left is a Marine who was crowned king on La Gonave, which is a little island off the coast of Haiti. And in it, he often talks about how he's sympathetic with the people, how he understands how they feel after gaining independence and then being occupied by the US forces. However, Vodou needs to be eradicated at any cost. And he vividly discusses different missions that he goes on. In the one on the right, this is called Cannibal Cousins by John Craig. He mentions a voodoo doll for one of the first accounts where we actually read about a doll with pins in it. Probably sensationalized, I would say. There's very little evidence of dolls in Haiti or Vodou, which I will talk about later. But the biggest problem for Haiti was the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church did not accept Vodou and systematically ran anti-superstition campaigns where the church was supported by the military, the police and the government to eradicate Vodou completely from the island. What's really surprised me when I found out about these is how little I'd known about them. They took place in 1896, 1912, 1913, 1925, 1930, 1940, 1941, and most recently, and this really shocked me, 1986. This was a systematic persecution of Vodou practitioners. And what they did was to raid any Vodou temples. So any Vodou temples or peristels that were in existence, they raided them. They burned ceremonial objects. Thousands and thousands of objects have been lost over time. They cut down sacred trees. Trees were often adorned with ribbons and with offerings, gone. They imprisoned Vodou priests or lynched and executed them on the spot accidentally because they weren't supposed to. And they slaughtered followers. Many, thousands were killed in the name of religion. And this is under the guidance of the Catholic Church. It's impossible to think that within the last century this occurred. The worst one was in 1941 when they swept from one side of the country to the other trying to totally destroy it. But they failed. They did not stamp out Vodou. They did not eradicate it, but they did drive it underground. And when you think the latest anti-superstition campaign was as recent as 1986, this is why Haitians are very suspicious of people from the West interested in their culture and wanting to see a ceremony or a sensationalized image of their religion. This painting is just one of from 1995 illustrating the superstition campaign. So as well as those persecutions from authorities, Vodou was receiving its Hollywood treatment. Misrepresentations in books and articles had been published, including, there was one which I haven't got a cover of, William Seabrook's Magic Island, which was utilised as a foundation for plays, for cinema, for novels, and it caught the public imagination. This exotic island in the Caribbean filled with this otherness, this mysticism of Vodou, of the walking dead, of strange practices. White Zombie was released in 1932, Bela Lugosi, highlighted here as Bela Dracula Lugosi. It did attempt authenticity, and it's one of the only Vodou, or Voodoo now, cinema performances where they try and link Haiti with Voodoo. There are mentions of how it evolved in Haiti. It talks about being set in Haiti. It talks about zombies. It talks about voodoo. Interestingly, there's an opening scene where they talk about the West Indies belonging to us, and it's a white couple. No mention of the independence or the revolution. But White Zombie grabbed attention. Interestingly, the zombie in this one is a white female. But worth a watch, definitely worth a watch. But in 1943, I Walked with a Zombie was released. It was loosely, and I say very loosely because I still can't see the connection, based on Jane Eyre. If you want to watch it and try and make the links, please do. But it was supposed to be linked to give it some credibility. But the iconography in it came from images of Haiti through the American occupation, through travel accounts. The zombie in this is quite benign. He's helpful. He's trying to protect the white zombie who is possessed. It's showing that all the malicious cursing and spells is created by a white woman. It's a very interesting twist, but this was really the end. These two offerings were the only two that tried to authenticate Vodou. It then became Voodoo, and from the late 1960s onwards took on a whole different meaning with zombies and all the other cultural appropriations. Stereotypes abound in the 60s and 70s, as I mentioned earlier. This is a still from one of the Scooby-Doo episodes with the little dolls with the pins stuck in them, and they refer to it as voodoo. The iconic Baron Samedi in the graveyard in Live and Let Die. So this had really, with literature from the turn of the century through to the 1930s, Hollywood from the 1930s, popular culture then through to the 70s, it really shaped what we thought and what we think of as voodoo. With Vodou being driven underground and not being widely known about, it's not surprising that our understanding and misconceptions are there. It's no reason why they shouldn't be. It was finally accepted as a religion in 1987. The Vatican finally conceded that with over 10 million followers worldwide, well in excess of 10 million followers, Voodoo would finally be deemed a religion. And that's 1987, which to me is mind-blowing. But it's been practiced worldwide. It's widely practiced in the US and Haiti, but the diaspora is global. I'm just going to talk a little bit now about the visual culture, because art and visual culture are part and parcel of Voodoo. There's no written text, but there's so many images that tell so many stories. And I just want to share some with you. This is a community building in Haiti. You can see all the references to Voodoo, to history, to life in a Haitian village. In the 1940s, art in Haiti was discovered, even though it had been happening for years. It was discovered, and Hector Hippolyte is a Voodoo priest, but he's an artist and he believes he's led by the spirit. So all of his paintings are related to the Loa or are directed by the Loa. Highly collectible now. His work fetches for great sums of money, but he's in collections around the world, and he really helped to bring art to the fore from Haiti. André Pierre, Maîtresse la Sirène of the Sweet Waters by André Pierre. In this one, you can see the little altar for Baron Samedi, but you can see the Veve painted across, and La Sirène is a mermaid, a spirit of the water. But these beautiful pictures, again, André Pierre believes he is led by the spirits. These are two of the Voodoo flags, sometimes referred to as replacement stained glass windows. They shimmer with colour, widely available even today. Some of the more well-known artists are obviously fetching great figures, but you can pick these up. Excuse me. The Veve, intricately drawn patterns on the floor. This one is for Azili. Transient, disappear, so we've only got photographs. Obviously there's loads of drawings now and they're incorporated in paintings, but the actual Veve are on the ground and are then dispersed. The Pake Congo, these relate back to the Congo. They're believed to hold spirits, they're believed to be very powerful, there's spells made in them to relate to people in power usually, but they, in Congo in particular, they're very powerful and quite sinister. In Haiti less so, they're more for positive energy. Of course, the altars, offerings to the different spirits. This one is predominantly for, well, we've got Baron Samedi with the coffins, but we've also got Azuli, who is represented by Mary, and you can see the skulls, which all relate to the Baron, and black and red, which are his colours, and rum bottles I spot. And they're both inside buildings and outside. This again is a street altar, which people can just make offerings to. They're there, they're for everybody's use. There's no discretion about who can and can't use them. Also metalwork, calling on the spirits, the Loa. Georges Lyotard was very, very popular in the 40s and 50s. He made these beautiful iron crosses. Unfortunately, most of them were stolen when he became popular. But some do still adorn cemeteries around Haiti, and he also makes a lot of metalwork, and metalwork sculptures are indigenous to Haiti. Voodoo, during and following the revolution in Haiti, some French plantation owners fled to Louisiana, and in particular New Orleans, and you can find Voodoo and New Orleans go hand in hand. And if any of you have been lucky enough to go, you know that in the French Quarter, it's Voodoo everything. Food, souvenirs, shops, everything is around Voodoo. But the Historic Voodoo Museum does hold genuine artefacts and does try and convey. And there are working altars in there, and they have ceremonies. It's very different, and it's known as Voodoo in New Orleans. But Voodoo continues to sustain its strength and its presence. And when the French plantation owners took their slaves to Louisiana and New Orleans, they met up with the Cajuns and other cultures, and then Voodoo changed again, and that's how it is. And I couldn't end without mentioning the Voodoo Doll. there's very little mention of voodoo dolls in Haitian Vodou, apart from the odd occasional reference for healing. And then I came across these dolls, which were photographed in Haiti in the 1980s and 1990s. And all three of them have been made to heal, not to harm. Not a pin in sight, just purely for healing purposes, to channel positive energy. In New Orleans, a slightly different story. The ones on the left you will find everywhere. They come with a black pin and a white pin. You're invited to buy them. They're only about $1 each or $2. And you can stab them and think of doing harm or good to people. And if you look closely, you can see they're made in China. So not really authentic, but massive selling point for tourists. The one on the right is an authentic doll. It's actually my own. And this one was made by a priestess. It's representative of the lower of the dead, but a female one called Mama Bridget, who is also the matriarch of the dead and for lost women in your families. And she is just beautiful. And that is more what you would expect to find as a New Orleans voodoo doll, not the little things on the left. Okay, so I'm going to finish by just sharing a little bit of a soundbite of, it's only 30 seconds, but this gives you an idea of what it sounds like at a voodoo ceremony in New Orleans. They're painting the veve on the floor with chalk, ready for Baron Samedi, but I hope it gives you a sound. It's the atmosphere. Okay, so I hope that you've learned something from this. It was a very whistle-stop and a very superficial explanation of what Vodou is, but I do hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you learned a little bit of something about Voodoo and Vodou. It's been my absolute pleasure. So if you've got any questions, then please start typing into the Q&A. If we run out of time, please feel free to contact me after the event and I will do my best. But I hope it's shown you that Vodou is colourful, it's celebratory, and it's not anything to do with the macabre and the sinister and death and destruction. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Louise. That was wonderful. Really fascinating. Thank you. We've got several questions already. And if I just read them out for you. The first one is from Charlene. Is Satanic worshipping and Santeria an offshoot of voodoo or Vodou?
Okay. Santeria is found in Cuba, and it's very similar. It's the same sort of process. It was the slaves that came from West Africa were then displaced to Cuba, so they then formed their syncretic religion, which is Santeria. Satanic worship is it's a contentious issue because there are dark sides to all of the practices, without a doubt. Even in religion, you get dark, good and evil, you get demons and angels. Satanic worshipping, I don't think, is anything to do with voodoo. It's more to do with Christianity than it is to do with voodoo, because there isn't, in voodoo and Santeria and Candomblé and Obia, there isn't that idea of a devil as such as we have. It's not that black and white and that binary.
Okay, thank you. From Eglantina, some authors link voodoo with Catholicism, not only in Africa.
Yeah, voodoo, Catholicism was used to overshadow across the world. Catholicism was the religion that was deemed to be appropriate for slaves to be baptized into. So wherever slaves, and that happened, it was in places like Brazil, across the Caribbean, and other places where the Catholic faith was then imposed on slaves. So wherever slaves went, you tend to find Catholicism is linked to voodoo. And voodoo is generally used to cover all of these religions, even though it's not. It's used as a general term.
Okay, thank you. And from Juliana, could you repeat St. Patrick's voodoo counterpart, please?
Yeah, St. Patrick's is Damballa, sometimes spelled D-A-N, sometimes D-A-M, B-A-L-L-A-H, but Damballa because he's got his images of the serpents.
Okay, thank you. And from Kat, she's interested in any food related to voodoo practices and culture, particularly of any native of foraged plants. Thank you.
I haven't really looked into this other than the offerings. So white rice is quite common. Other than I will look at, if you want to email me separately, that would be fine, and I will look, because I've got lists and lists of the lower and what their food stuff is. Off the top of my head, I wouldn't be able to remember them all, but there's a food stuff which could include plants, which is linked to every lower. So some are quite straightforward, it's rum or it's rice or potato, but some are would-be plants. So if you can email me, Kat, I'd be happy to send you a copy of the list of all the lower I've got. And there are many.
Okay, thanks, Louise. Thumbelinas asks, do you know the significance of the shakers in ritual?
Yeah, the shakers tend to be made from the gourd. So that they grow and they're used. They tend to, sometimes they use snake vertebra on them, but it's just again part of that idea to bring sound together with the drumming to evoke the spirits, so to really wake them up and make them want to come and join in, because the whole idea is to bring a spirit down to the material world to help. But they're beautiful, and you get them, some are made, like I said, snake vertebra, or some are made from beads, but they are always part of the ceremony.
Okay, thank you. And Mockingjay just wanted to say thank you very much. It was really interesting.
Thank you.
And Mary, thanks, Louise. So interesting and so positive. I've always been fearful of it. So Hollywood had worked a treat on me, she says. Georgia, thank you for this very interesting talk. Do you have any academic books or studies that you recommend for further study on Voodoo and its history, please?
Georgia, if you could drop me an email, I will happily send you a reader. My PhD thesis is available online if you wanted to look at it. Just look for Louise Fenton, Representations of Voodoo, and you'll get the link. Academic books, there are numerous, but in particular, I think as a starting point, there's one by Lainak Hurbon, Hurbon, called Voodoo, Myth and Reality. I think it's only a little book, it's very small, but it is packed with history. It's got documents at the back. Great starting point.
Okay, and I think that answers the next question as well from Juliana, who says, very interesting, thank you. What would you suggest to begin reading up on Voodoo and its history? So the things that you've just mentioned.
Yeah, I definitely think Lainak Hurbon's book is a great starter, because it's full of pictures and paintings and photographs and documents, and it's divided really well, so it gives a thorough history and talks about the religion as well. Okay, wonderful.
Linda asks if she could have a copy of the recording, and yes, a copy of the recording will be available on the University Centre Telford YouTube channel. So we'll put the links and everything on Facebook and let you know. That will be available. Thank you. And Anna T says, did they take elixirs during these ceremonies?
No, but they did take rum. Not an elixir as such, but a lot of them do have a good swig of rum at the start, because under the auspices that it's an offering to the spirits. They do spit some of it out onto the veve. But no, it's really strange. It's that, I think if ever you get a chance, they're open ceremonies at Halloween in New Orleans. So if ever you get to go to the French Quarter in New Orleans, they shut a road off and they do a proper ceremony. And you will realise that the sound of the rattles and the drums and the chanting really builds the momentum, and I don't think you would need an elixir.
Fantastic. So Kat, who asked a question previously, says that she's going to email and follow up on the question. That's brilliant. Pamela says that from her own readings, she thinks that the idea of the voodoo doll is an offshoot from the use of puppets, occult or Wiccan roots, as Hollywood likes to merge things together. I'm thinking this is where that idea came from.
Pamela, you've made me realise I did miss a section out on my voodoo doll section. Absolutely, it comes from European witchcraft. The idea of the pins in the dolls was purely a Hollywood creation. As I said, no Haitian doll has ever been found with pins in it. It is from the word poppets, and that's, if you saw my talk last week, or I think I'm giving a talk in a few weeks about a cursed doll. The use of poppets in witchcraft is specifically to harm, to stick a pin or a dagger into an effigy, whereas voodoo doll, the only dolls found in Haitian Vodou are for healing. And yes, Hollywood does like to merge things together. I gave a talk, I think last year, I think it was called Cultural Confusion, and it was this mismatch of witchcraft, voodoo, black magic, Satanism, and how they've just sort of lodged it together and misled us for many, many years.
Okay, thank you. More recommendations for further reading. So I think you've done that.
Again, Hannah, if you want to drop me an email and I'll put together a little reading list. I don't know if we could post it somewhere, Paula.
Yes, we could. Yeah, we could put it on Facebook or on Twitter. So yeah, that's fine. And Pamela, just to say that she's enjoying the talk, hoping for more, and she was around for last week's too, so that's great to hear. Xperia L3, did Vodou in Haiti change at all because of the 2010 earthquake or HIV crisis of the 80s?
Vodou adapts, it changes, it morphs into other things, and it's utilised for the current situation. The earthquake destroyed the cathedral, which had beautiful paintings by Hector Hippolyte. Very few of those survived, but it emerges and it's used as a force. Bon Dieu, who's God, they believe that everything is God's will, and everything that happens is for a reason, and they then turn to the spirits. So although it may change, you see appropriations of American culture in the 1980s in particular, but it's still, there's a well-known saying, it's 80% Catholic, 20% Protestant, and 100% Vodou in Haiti. And I think that's probably a fair account.
Okay, another thank you from Deborah, saying thank you for a really interesting lecture. Eric is suggesting Thora Neale Hurston's book, Tell My Horse.
That's Zora, it should be Z-O-R-A, but Zora Neale Hurston, yes, definitely. She was an anthropologist and a black academic. Her life in itself is fascinating, but she wrote some amazing books.
Okay, and another comment about the link between the voodoo doll as a means for harm taken from puppets and witchcraft.
Yes, definitely, that's it exactly.
Yeah. Thumbelina, thank you so much for this. I have a pair of shakers given to me from a friend from a holiday. They're beautiful, but very like the ones in the video. So presumably from
somewhere in the Caribbean, I would imagine.
Yes. Mary says, are the Haitians angry about the way their religion has been distorted and degraded?
Absolutely, and you can understand why. And although tourism obviously is now stopped altogether, tourism became when tourism was open in Haiti, people wanted to see ceremonies. But if you think about what I've talked about, how it was persecuted, even in the 1980s, there was an anti-superstition campaign to burn and destroy any voodoo temple or Peristel. They're angry about the fact their own government has persecuted them and the West has persecuted them, compounded by the fact that Hollywood has created a version of voodoo which has nothing to do with Haitian Vodou. And I'm hoping that over time, as people like me sort of speak out and show people what it's about, the tide will turn. But we've got centuries of misrepresentation and racism to overcome.
Okay, thanks, Louise. Sarah says, have you seen more dolls in Vodou who represent the Loire?
No, no, it's really interesting. There's an artist called Piero Barra, B-A-R-R-A. He died a few years ago, but he was believed to be a Bokor, who's a priest of the dark arts of Vodou. And he created these beautiful artworks which featured a lot of dolls, and he believed that the dark spirits led him to make the artwork. He was guided by his spirits. So although they don't represent a specific Loa, his artwork is very dark and represents the Gede spirits, or the spirits of the dead, using dolls. So you will see them included in some imagery, although not as in a specific representation. Occasionally you might find a statuette of Mary for a Zili on an altar, but not very often.
Okay, thank you. All the way from India, thank you so much from Tanvi for the invigorating talk. Gratitude from India.
Oh,
so that's lovely to know that we've obviously got a worldwide audience again. Josephine says, could you send us the link for the recording? So yes, we will post it on University Centre Telford Facebook page, and it will give you the link for our YouTube channel, but it will take us a little while to get it edited and everything, but it will be there. So that's fine. And then the next one is similar. How do we find Louise's email? Where will the recording be posted? So that will be on our Facebook page.
And just if you are listening, my email address is just louise.fenton@wlv.ac.uk.
Okay.
Or just look me up on the University of Wolverhampton, you'll find me.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Now, the next one is a very long comment and then some questions from Steph. Thank you very much. That was absolutely outstanding. I've thoroughly enjoyed it and learned so much. Previously studied law and done my dissertation on human trafficking. Quite often in my research, when there were reports on people being trafficked in the modern age from Africa, quite often in my readings, such as UN reports discussing the matter, they often referred to some modern slavers of trafficking victims would control or make them live in fear by using witchcraft and voodoo. Do you think such reports made of this have completely misunderstood voodoo and are thus misrepresenting this peaceful religion and creating a bad representation of voodoo by people who are getting the wrong idea of it? Perhaps getting more experts from voodoo and the matter of human trafficking is needed in future to prevent misunderstandings and discrimination.
That's a really interesting question, Steph, and I could probably talk to you for hours about this. There are dark sides of voodoo, without a doubt, and you have to understand that there are people who are believers and followers of voodoo that know curses exist. They believe that, especially in New Orleans, people are incredibly superstitious, and if they see a chicken's foot buried under their front door or some symbol, they are incredibly frightened. And there are scientific evidences of voodoo, what are called voodoo deaths, where people have been so frightened that they've been cursed, they've died. Although there's no scientific link between an object and the curse and the person, they've still died. Voodoo and witchcraft are feared because there are priests called Bokors who are believed to practice the dark arts. And in the case of slavery, I think some of it is misunderstood and automatically it's jumped on whenever there's something that's a bit sinister or a bit different or markings are seen. You know, we're contacted to say, is this witchcraft, is this voodoo? And it's not, it's somebody just doing something a bit weird. So there is that misunderstanding, but there is also a cultural element which does instill fear. So I hope that kind of talks, but please email me and I'll be happy to have a chat to you about it. Fascinating question.
Great, thank you. Just a request for the reading list to be on Facebook as well as Twitter from somebody who doesn't do Twitter, so that's fine. Xperia L3 again asks, is there anywhere in the UK that sells Haitian Vodou art?
There was, and it closed. It was in Bristol. There was only one place, which is really frustrating, and perhaps I ought to look into it. There are a lot of online stores. Most are run from the States, but I would just stress, check the integrity of them, because there are quite a few that exploit. Obviously, buying art in Haiti is very cheap. They then inflate the prices and make huge profits. But I believe there is an art gallery in Haiti. An American moved there, but she runs an art gallery from Haiti. She does put a premium on the artwork, but she supports local artists in Haiti. So I would probably look at Haiti as the initial place for voodoo art before you start looking on the American market.
Yeah, okay. And Anna T, so she's been to New Orleans and visited the museum. There was a priest who showed us an albino snake which goes around the necks of a marriage couple at the time of their wedding to understand one another better. They seem to use snakes a lot. Why? Thank you.
Okay, the snake you're talking to is actually called Jolie Blanc, and I've had her around my neck.
Oh, wow.
It's incredibly heavy. She's died. And sadly, she died a few years ago. She was huge, so I'm glad you got to see her, because there is still a shrine to her. Jolie Blanc. They do use snakes a lot, and that's because in West Africa, and some of the beliefs do use snakes. Dambala, as I said, a lot of the spirits in Vodou have snakes. Serpents are, it's that idea of the never-ending, you've got the tail and the head and that perpetual, eternal life and death. But it originates in West Africa, and then in New Orleans, especially at the museum, Mr. Gandolfo, who runs it, Jolie Blanc was his, and he's no longer with us.
Okay, and one final question from Magenta. Will you be talking on Wicca, witchcraft and the occult?
Okay. Well, hopefully we've got to talk about what else I can talk about. Zombies is obviously one that's come up a few times. I've written quite a lot on zombies and how they evolved. But I'm happy to keep doing the talks. I am doing a talk for the university as part of Arts Fest on the one of the cursed puppets from the collection at the Museum of Witchcraft, and that's on the 15th of July at 5 p.m.
Okay.
So if you look on Arts Fest, University of Wolverhampton, you should be able to find it.
Brilliant. And that's on Zoom as well, isn't it?
Yes, it will be. I've requested it's on Zoom,
Yeah, okay, that's brilliant. Thank you very much. And that's all the questions, I think, Louise. Okay. All 32 of them.
Thank you.
Okay, so thank you ever so much, Louise. That was fascinating as ever. I learned so much there, and like Mary, I was somewhat afraid, I think, of voodoo, and that's really allayed my fears, I think. So thank you. And thank you very much to everyone who's attended as well, and so many people asking questions. It makes such a difference when we have so many people who are engaged and really interested and passionate, and from all around the world as well. So we'll liaise with Louise, and hopefully there'll be further talks. Oh, I can just see another couple of
some last minute
comments.
Oh, thank you.
Yes, has thoroughly enjoyed this. Thank you, and a thank you from Xperia L3 as well. So,
well, I'd like to extend my thanks to everybody that's sat and listened. As I said, it's a very strange experience not seeing any audience and talking to a screen. And thank you, Paula, and all the team at UTC for all their support. And it's great to get all this work out there.
Yeah, it is fantastic. Thank you once again, Louise, and thank you to everybody who stayed with us. Hopefully we'll see you again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye. Bye, everyone.